Now, the unconscious have been relegated to the margins for much of the 20th century, at least in the sciences, because, as Karl Popper famously put it, it's unfalsifiable. But research in the last 30 years in cognitive neurosciences demonstrate that very little of what goes in the brain is actually conscious, opening up a whole new area of investigation, which has been very fruitful for dialogue between the humanities scholars and the sciences. And our first speaker is one of the scholars who pioneered this field, and he's Professor Larry Squire, Distinguished Professor of Psychiatry, Neurosciences and Psychology at UCSD, and he has published over 490 papers on the matter and established empirically that the human memory system is comprised of two separate systems, the conscious memory system and the unconscious memory system. His landmark paper, Memory and the Hippocampus, a synthesis from findings with rats, monkeys and humans, has been cited nearly 3,000 times. He's former president of the Society for Neuroscience and a member of the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has won many awards and honors, the last of which is the Goldman Rukish Prize for Cognitive Neuroscience, which was last year. So today, I present to you Professor Larry Squire on conscious and unconscious memory systems of the mammalian brain.
Oh, thanks very much. What I'll try to do today is to introduce you to some of the concepts and the categories that frame our current understanding about the structure and organization of memory, and I'll try to focus particularly on how the biological distinction between conscious and unconscious memory became a prominent topic for study in the neurosciences, and I'll try to describe what it is that we've learned. Well, memory is a large topic. It's based on the fundamental fact that the experiences we have can modify the nervous system so that later on our mental life and our behavior can be different as a result of what happened in the past. This image comes from the Greek island of Santorini, and with its charming name, Memories Hotel, which perhaps suggests nostalgia and perhaps intimacy, and it reminds us that memory is personal and evocative and intertwined with emotion and a fundamental part of what we are. Well, the neuroscience of memory is concerned with questions about structure, and that means psychological categories as well as neuroanatomy, structure, organization, and mechanism. Work proceeds on many levels, from molecular and cellular questions about the nature of synaptic change to the more systems level questions that I'll be addressing today about what is memory, is it one thing or many things, what are the brain structures that support memory, and what operations do they carry out in the service of memory. Well, let me put the matter in perspective by first considering memory as an extension of perception. So we call this a simplified diagram of the primate visual system. This is from work with non-human primates. Each of these boxes represents a separate processing unit for visual or visual spatial information. Each of these boxes would contain on the order of 10 million to 100 million neurons. Now, information from the external world first reaches the cortex at the back of the brain in area V1, moving over here now. And from area V1, information moves forward both in series and in parallel along two separate pathways, sometimes called the ventral pathway and the dorsal pathway. The ventral pathway reaches its culmination in what is called area TE in the infratemporal cortex, where representations are achieved about visual object quality, about what an object is, its orientation, its size, and its color, for example. Along the dorsal pathway, information reaches its pinnacle in the parietal cortex, where information is represented about where objects are in space and what computations are needed to reach out and get to places in space. Well, from there, connections move forward to a number of different target areas, for example, to the frontal lobe for the purposes of converting perception into action, to the amygdala, not shown here, for the purposes of connecting perception to emotion, and other subcortical targets, including the striatum and the pons. But for today, we'll be concentrating on the connections between these areas, these perceptual areas, and these areas down here, which lie in the medial surface of the temporal lobe, and which accomplishes the task of converting or transforming perception into memory. So, for example, if one damages or removes any of these areas up here, one produces a particular kind of visual spatial deficit. But if one removes the area down here, one produces what we call a memory impairment. Now, the modern era of this problem can be said to have begun in 1957, when Brenda Milner at McGill University described the profound effects on memory of a bilateral medial temporal lobe resection, which was carried out as a frankly experimental procedure to relieve severe epilepsy in a patient who famously became known as HM. I might mention that Brenda Milner just turned 96 this summer. She just was in Oslo a few months ago to receive the Kavli Prize, and she goes to her laboratory every day still at McGill University. This drawing shows the location of the hippocampus and the amygdala and the adjacent cortex that was removed in patient HM bilaterally. At the time, it wasn't known what damage within this large geographical territory was responsible for HM severe memory impairment, and was rather thought that the hippocampus itself was the important structure, mainly because we knew more about the hippocampus than the other structures that were involved. But the identity of the important structures, and especially the fact that the cortex adjacent to the hippocampus is important, this became gradually understood during the 1980s, following the successful development of an animal model of human memory impairment in the non-human primate. Here we see a ventral surface of the monkey brain, the front of the brain on the left, the back of the brain on the left. And what you're seeing in here are what became the candidate areas that were important for memory, areas that were removed from HM and were candidate structures for understanding his memory impairment. We don't see the hippocampus, which is buried beneath the surface in this posterior location here, or the amygdala, which is buried here. But what we are seeing is the entorhinal cortex, which is of interest because the entorhinal cortex originates the major afferent projections into the hippocampus. And these structures here, the perirhinal cortex and the perihippocampal cortex, which originate 2/3 of the cortical input into the entorhinal cortex. So this whole area can be thought of as one of the target zones, or one of the target objectives of projections that come from wide areas of neocortex, which are involved in vision and other kinds of processing, and ultimately the storage of long-term memory. Now, once the animal model was in place, it became a solvable problem for cumulative science to work out the answer to the question of what are the important structures for memory, and how do we understand HM memory impairment. And this is a topic that we took on in San Diego and was also worked on heavily by Mort Michigan at NIH, and it took about 12 years. But in the end, we could describe what we found in 3 simple declarative sentences. And here you're seeing a schematic of this region of the brain. The hippocampal region can be divided into the CA fields and the subiculum complex and the dentate gyrus and these other areas that I just mentioned. And the 3 declarative sentences go like this. First, that the hippocampus itself is critical, and damage limited to the hippocampus can produce an easily detectable and clinically significant memory impairment. Secondly, the amygdala, which was a candidate structure, is important for other things, but not important for understanding HM's memory impairment. And third, what was new, and what even required some new neuroanatomy, was the discovery that these structures here, the entorhinal, perirhinal, and perihippocampal cortices, which lie adjacent to and anatomically connected to the hippocampus, that these structures are also important. And these structures, together with the hippocampus, comprise what we now refer to as the medial temporal lobe memory system. And here we see this system illustrated in the 3 species that have been most prominent in this tradition of work: the human brain, the monkey brain, and the rodent brain, which can also be a proxy for the mouse brain. And all that one has to remember and has to simply memorize the fact that the nomenclature, the terminology is a little bit different in the rat than in the human and the monkey, and that is that the areas that are referred to as perihippocampal cortex here in the human and the monkey is referred to as post-rhinal cortex in the rat brain. Well, damage to this entire system here profoundly affects memory, essentially eliminates the capacity for memory. What you're looking at here is a horizontally oriented MRI scan, a structural scan of a patient we had a chance to study for a long time, a patient known as EP, who became profoundly amnesic in 1992 at the age of 70 following a bout of viral encephalitis. And what you're seeing here, the front of the brain at the top, the back of the brain at the bottom here, and what you're seeing in white is the abnormal tissue. And what's essentially happened is that this virus carved out the medial temporal lobe memory system. The amygdala is gone, although that wasn't relevant to his memory impairment. The hippocampus is entirely gone. The perirhinal cortex is entirely gone. And the perihippocampal cortex is damaged about 50% of its rostral aspect. EP is so amnesic that he doesn't have the insight, and never had the insight that he has amnesia, because he never was able to develop a new understanding of himself as a result of his memory problem. A few years ago, EP and his family volunteered to participate in the Scientific American's Frontier of Science television program hosted by the American actor Alan Alda. So I have an opportunity to play you a short, about a 3-minute clip that will give you, I think, a nice sense of what this profound amnesia looks like. And what you'll see is for example, the distinction between an intact short-term memory and an impaired long-term memory. You'll see the fact that his personality and intellectual ability, perceptual ability are there, and that his amnesia occurs against a background of rather intact personality, perception, and intellectual abilities.
EP can also copy complex drawings. And he not only has no difficulty repeating back a list of words, in this case, dog, raccoon, lion, and parrot.
Dog, raccoon, lion, and a parrot.
But he even has a little sly fun with Jen along the way.
What you gotta add is about 2 more.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Would that make it tougher?
And that would get, leaf, medicine.
EP really hits his stride when the testing of his cognitive skills involves Jen's laptop computer.
Gold, having been in electronics over the years, I am amazed at all this. It's just wonderful. Believe me, little printed circuits, just, oh, you can't believe it. It used to be in a 6-foot rack, and down to this, it's just wonderful. When I was in electronics, this would be in a 6-foot rack.
But it's now that something odd about EP's behavior becomes apparent.
Printed circuits, diodes, triodes, and all that stuff in there. Oh, it's just amazing, believe me. When I was in electronics, this would be in a 6-foot rack. This would be in a 6-foot rack. It would be in a couple 6-foot racks. It would be in a 6-foot rack. This would be in a 6-foot rack. And now look at it, down to this. Little printed circuits. And
So he's not aware that he's told us 3 or 4 times that he used to be in electronics, that a computer used to fill a room, and that now it's down to the size of a microchip. He's just not aware that he said those things several times.
No, he tells us the same stories again and again. We've heard these stories before, and we'll hear these stories again.
I read you some words about 15 minutes ago. 4 of them. 4 words. Do you remember me reading you 4 words?
no, I can't recall. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
My mind is getting old.
That's okay. I read you 4 animals, and I want you to tell me yes if you think the animal was on the list I read you about 15 minutes ago, or no if it was not on the list. Okay? Cat.
Yes.
How sure are you?
I feel reasonably sure on
You
that cat.
Uh-huh. Raccoon.
No. I feel no.
Giraffe.
Yes.
How sure are you that I
I'm real sure on that.
Real sure?
They're beautiful animals.
Okay. Lion.
No.
Okay. Do you remember drawing something for me today?
No.
Drawing something about
No.
15 or 20 minutes ago?
No.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
They don't apologize.
Okay, good to have the lights back up. I might mention this points out the fallacy of small samples, because if it were really true that he answered every single question wrong, it would mean that he had a lot of information about the list. But I can tell you that in formal experiments, he always scores exactly a chance. Scores randomly on tests like that. Well, recall that an EP's lesion was a large lesion involving the whole medial-temporal lobe. A lesion limited to the hippocampus itself has a much less severe effect on memory. And now I'm showing you a frontally organized or coronal section of the structural MRI of a patient on the right that we had a chance to study for a number of years. He became amnesic, modestly amnesic, in 1984 as a result of a respiratory distress. So if you look over on the left at a age-matched healthy individual, you can see the temporal lobe here. You can follow it around its external surface into its medial surface, where you can see the hippocampus lodged in the 3rd ventricle. You can see the extent to which it fills the ventricle. You can even see some gray and white matter nameable anatomical tracts within the hippocampus itself. But if you cast your eye over to the right, I think even with an untrained eye, you can appreciate the fact that LM's hippocampus is abnormally small, and about 45% of its normal size on formal measurement. It's atrophic, and in fact, when LM died in 1990 of a carcinoma, and we carried out a detailed neuropathological study of his brain, we could determine that, in fact, this reduction corresponded to a loss of all the cells in the hippocampus. So I just say that to mention if one hears about a 45% reduction in volume of the structure, one shouldn't immediately assume that 55% of it is operating normally. So let's compare these two levels of severity in EP and LM. This is a well-known neuropsychological test where a subject is asked to copy this nonsense figure, and then some minutes later, 10 minutes later, without forewarning, the subject is invited to reconstruct it from memory. So here you see very nice copies of both patients and the control subject. Here you see the reproduction of the control. Did a very good job. It's not as hard as it sounds because they've spent all these minutes reconstructing it and drawing it in the first place. Here you see LM's reproduction, which is, although it certainly has a resemblance to the target, it's outside the range of what a healthy individual would produce. And here you see EP, like as on the film you saw, he didn't even remember he made a drawing a few minutes ago, and he declined to make any kind of a guess. So building on this tradition, what I'd like to do then is to briefly illustrate three key ideas based on work with humans and non-human primates. The first is that memory is not a single faculty of the mind. There are different kinds of memory supported by different brain systems. And the major distinction to be drawn is between our capacity for conscious declarative memory, and by there I mean facts and events, declarative memory on the one hand, and unconscious non-declarative memory on the other hand. Where performance changes as a result of experience, and in that sense deserves the term memory, but where performance changes without even requiring any conscious memory content, and on many occasions even the awareness that memory is being used. And here I'm talking about things like skills and habits, and I'll be illustrating some of these by example in a moment. Secondly, in the context of multiple memory systems, I'll describe how one memory system can sometimes substitute for another, but the result, the cognitive product, is very different depending on which system is used. Some tasks that you and I learn declaratively, quickly, with the support of declarative conscious memory by memorizing. These tasks can also be learned gradually, that is, non-declaratively, entirely outside of awareness, and without any involvement or any contribution from the medial temporal lobe. And third, and even more briefly, I'll mention that the medial temporal lobe structures that we're speaking about here have a temporary role in the formation and the maintenance of memory, an idea that we best understand for the hippocampus itself. It's very remote memory, including spatial memory, are intact after medial temporal lobe damage, which means that the medial temporal lobe is not the ultimate repository of memory. Memories are stored in a distributed fashion in neocortex and in correspondence with the areas that are needed to process information in the first place. Well, a striking finding then about the organization of memory was that the same patients that we're discussing here, the same patients who are so profoundly impaired at conventional memory tests, these patients are nonetheless fully intact at certain kinds of tasks that assess the effects of experience on behavior and that are memory tasks. The first example of this came from Brenda Milner herself in this famous experiment done in 1962, in which HM, to her surprise and to everybody else's surprise, HM was able to trace the contours, trace the outline of a double contoured star in a mirror. And he learned to do that over time. First you make mistakes at every time you make a corner, but you get better at it. And he did better on the first day, still better on the second day, and nearly perfectly on the third day, even though on each day he had no memory that he'd done the task before. Colin Blakemore from Oxford University, in his popular book Mechanics of Mind, supposed, well, that's maybe meant that motor skills are special, and motor skills are down here in the cerebellum, and everything else is of one piece, and that's up here in the cortex. And that's kind of how we all thought about it for some time. But then in 1980, we were able to show that these same amnesic patients are able to learn not just motor skills, but perceptual skills, like learning to read mirror reverse print. It's rather difficult the first time through, and one can take as long as 60 or 70 seconds to get all three of them. But eventually one gets better at it, and one gets better and better. Hypnotic, apocalypse, and functional. And it turned out that amnesic patients learn this task at a completely normal rate and can remember that skill completely at a normal level 3 months later, despite in many cases not remembering having done the task before. So we conceived this finding in terms of a distinction initially between what we call declarative and procedural knowledge, and we likened it to the Gilbert-Ryle's distinction in 1947 between knowing how and knowing that. But it turned out that this concept still wasn't really large enough to encompass the number of things that turned out to be outside the province of the medial temporal lobe and examples of non-declarative memory. So next I want to introduce you to still another phenomenon known as priming. Priming refers to an improvement in the ability to identify or process a stimulus as a result of a recent encounter with the same or related stimulus. Now that may just sound like another way of talking about memory, but I'll try to convince you that this is a very different kind of phenomenon altogether from regular memory. When what is improved is the processing of an item, we call it perceptual priming. And when what is improved is access to the meaning of an item and its associates, we call it conceptual priming. And I'm going to give you an example from conceptual priming. So this simple task, the subject first studies about 14 common English words. And after about 10 minutes, so we're outside the region where somebody could simply be rehearsing the words overtly, one is given a free association test. One says, what's the first word that comes to mind when you hear the word canvas? What's the first word that comes to mind when you hear the word strap? Well, there's about a 10% baseline effect. That is, there's about a 10% chance that you'll say the word anyway, even if you didn't study it recently. But if you did study it recently, there's now about a 25% chance that the word you pop out with will be that word. And here's control subjects, normal subjects, healthy subjects showing this 15% advantage. That's 15% above baseline, about a 25% chance of saying the word. Well, what's extraordinary is that patients with profound amnesia, including EP that you met, show this effect at full strength. And hippocampal patients also do a pretty good job at showing this phenomenon. And yet when you perform a parallel test of recognition memory, that is a test of familiarity where you see 14 words, but now the question is you're shown a series of 28 words, some are the old ones, some are new ones, and you're invited to make a judgment as to whether the words were or were not on the list. Of course, that's a trivial task for healthy subjects to get better than 90% correct. But the patients with amnesia are impaired on that. And in fact, EP, this is EP's data here, he scored no better than if he'd flipped a coin to determine his answer, although he performed it fully intact on the priming test. So this is telling us that priming is a completely independent phenomenon from the phenomenon of recognition memory or conventional declarative memory. I'm going to also illustrate the same basic idea in work with non-human primates. And in order to do that, I'm going to introduce you to two famous tasks that were used in this kind of work. This task is known as trial unique delayed non-matching to sample. It's a test of familiarity. It's a test of recognition judgments. What happens in this task is that at the beginning, on the first phase of the trial, the animal confronts what we call a junk object. The animal displaces the object to obtain a raising reward, thereby guaranteeing the animal's attention to the object. And then after a variable delay, the screen comes down, the objects are rearranged. After a delay as long as 10 minutes or 40 minutes, the animal sees what's shown here, the new object and an old object. And delayed non-matching to sample, the animal displaces the new object to obtain a reward, thereby indicating to the experimenter that the animal remembers the old and now less interesting object. So that's a test of recognition memory, the same kind of thing one could do in humans. Now let's consider a second task, a test of motor skill learning. Here the animal confronts a tube, a metal tube, a lifesaver has been threaded onto the tube, and the animal has the opportunity to slide the candy along the tube, negotiate a 90-degree turn, and then remove it and eat it as a candy reward, and one simply scores how long it takes the animal to do that. So let's look at the data for monkeys, with normal monkeys, monkeys with hippocampal lesions like patient LM, and monkeys with large medial temporal lobe lesions like patient EP. So here on the left you see the results for the recognition memory task with delays that range from 8 seconds to 10 minutes. And as you see in the normal monkeys, there's some forgetting across that delay as you would expect. Hippocampal animals show a modest degree of amnesia, a modest degree of forgetfulness. And the medial temporal lobe monkeys show a profound forgetfulness so that after 10 minutes they're performing by flipping a coin to determine which object they're going to choose. On the other hand, over here with skill learning, giving these animals 6 trials a day across 8 days initially, all the monkeys learned the task at exactly the same rate, and 1 or 2 months later, I mean, that is 1 month later on 2 different trials, the monkeys are performing the skill at a high level. So what that's telling us then is that the same monkeys who can't remember the identity of an object after 10 minutes are fully intact at showing day-to-day improvement in their learning across a period of 8 days. So what this all takes us to is this kind of a sketch of how many of us think about long-term memory at this point. We divide long-term memory into 2 major categories, declarative memory and non-declarative memory. So declarative memory is our memory for facts and events. Declarative memory is what we mean by the term memory when we use it in everyday language. It refers to I remember what we had for breakfast this morning and what we did a year ago, and the facts of our knowledge about the world and the specific events that we've experienced in the world. And this capacity depends on the integrity of the medial temporal lobe and brother and sister structures in the diencephalon, the thalamus and hypothalamus that I'm not speaking about today. Non-declarative memory is not a single thing, it's an umbrella term to encompass a whole variety of ways in which behavior can change as a result of experience. It includes skills and habits, which have a critical dependence on the striatum, that's the caudate nucleus, and the putamen. The phenomenon of priming that we spoke about in perceptual learning, which seem to be intrinsic to the neocortex. Simple classical conditioning, which can be divided into 2 parts, the conditioning of emotional responses, which in real life might mean something like the development of a phobia across time, or in the laboratory, fear conditioning, dependence on the amygdala, the conditioning of skeletal responses. In real life, that might be something like driving a motorcycle to a stop sign and negotiating the clutch and the brakes in association with each other. In the laboratory, that's usually thought of related to eye blink conditioning. And non-associative learning, which is a phenomenon like habituation and sensitization that are well developed in invertebrate animals that haven't yet invented a hippocampus but have a well-demonstrated ability to change their behavior as a result of experience in animals like the Ecclesia and Drosophila, that is the sea slug and the fruit fly. When I see all these terms, I'm always reminded of the quip that comes from Wilhelm Feldberg, who was a pharmacologist working in Britain with the great scientist Bernard Katz. And Feldberg said, there are some scientists who would rather use another scientist's toothbrush than use his terminology. But what I'd like to say is that the psychology has matured to the point where it can depend a lot on biology to make its classification. So it matters less what terms one uses up here because we know the brain structures and we know the systems that support these different kinds of behaviors. The idea, of course, is that all these systems work in parallel, work at the same time. So consider the hypothetical example of a young child of 10, let's say, who was knocked over by a large dog. And then one could say, well, at the age of 25, at least 2 different things have happened. One is that the individual may remember the incident. And to the extent that the person remembers the incident, one is calling on the integrity of the medial temporal lobe structures to remember this particular autobiographical event. But the second thing that may have happened is that the person may be afraid of dogs. And to the extent that the person is afraid of dogs, one is calling on the amygdala. And the point, of course, is that fear of dogs is not experienced as a memory. It's experienced as a piece of personality, an aptitude, a disposition, a way of behaving. So declarative memory is expressed through recollection, and non-declarative memory is expressed through performance. Now, one of the reasons it took a long time to work this all out is there are tasks that humans learn as declarative knowledge by memorizing, essentially, but tasks that animals and even monkeys will learn non-declaratively. And I'll give you an example of that from another task that's rather well known in the literature. And this is known as the concurrent 8-pair discrimination task. What happens in this task simply is that there are 8 pairs eventually to be learned. Each pair is presented one at a time. One of the objects is designated as correct, and of course the left or right position of the object is random. And subjects have to learn which object is correct in each of the pairs. Typically 40 trials are given in a day, so each object pair is presented 5 times. So if your intuition is like mine, if you were given this task to learn, you would simply try to memorize what the answer is for each task, and that's in fact how humans do that task. Here's an example from earlier work with control subjects learning the task rather easily over a period of a few days and even remembering it a month later, whereas amnesic patients struggle to learn. This is a mixed group of amnesic patients, not as profound as EP, learning a little and forgetting a little across time. So it was with some surprise when we discovered that monkeys with hippocampal lesions or even medial temporal lesions learn this task normally. Here are the data for normal monkeys learning this same task. They take almost 500 trials to learn it, and monkeys with hippocampal lesions learn the task in the same number of trials. However, when the lesion moves dorsally to also include the caudate nucleus, which is thought to be important for habit learning, then the animals were impaired, and others went on later to show that lesions limited to the caudate nucleus itself caused an impairment in this task. So this raises the question then, well, can patients with profound amnesia like EP, can patients with profound amnesia who have no capacity for declarative memory, could they acquire a task like this through gradual trial and error learning, through what we might term habit learning? If so, is unconscious knowledge acquired? And what does it mean to acquire unconscious knowledge? Or does the knowledge have different properties in declarative memory? Or are we so governed by particular strategies that one memory system cannot really substitute for another, as if each system has its own domain? Or perhaps habit memory is not so strongly developed in humans as it is in monkeys and rats. Or perhaps we always need a little bit of declarative memory to guide our performance, so that it wouldn't be possible without declarative memory to learn these kinds of things. So we asked this question of patient EP and a very similar patient known as GP. So patients were tested on the task, and here's control subject learning the task. It's a very simple task, and of course they showed good performance even on day one because, as I said, there's 40 trials and only 8 pairs, so by the time those pairs are coming around again on the first day, they're already remembering what they saw before, and by 3 days they're performing perfectly. Now, one of the features of declarative memory is that declarative memory is flexible, as you might intuit. I mean, once you learn something, you can do it with your hands, you can do it with your foot, you can talk about it, you can write about it. It's flexible knowledge. In order to bring that into the laboratory, we asked the subjects to perform the same task in a different way. We put the 16 objects in a pile in the middle of the table and said, please sort the objects into correct pile and incorrect pile. Well, if you've memorized which one is correct, that's a trivial exercise for a healthy subject, and they did it perfectly. And then, of course, when we reconstitute the test in its original way, again, they're perfect. So we asked this question of patient EP, first of all. And we tested him on twice a week on non-consecutive days over a period of time. And every day we asked him at the beginning of the day, we've been here many times, what are we going to do? And EP never was able to say anything better than, well, we're going to have a conversation, we're going to talk. And then we would pull out the objects, and he would ask him again, well, we use these objects, what do we do with the objects? And he never did anything more clear than saying, well, we'll talk about what their function is and what they're used for and what they are. So we began to give the test to EP. And EP, although quite gradually and over time, improved his performance to nearly perfectly across 18 weeks, 36 sessions, until he performed perfectly. And then we did the flexibility test to ask him, what did he know about what he knew. We put the 16 objects in the middle of the table, and we tape recorded every session. And we remember that when we put the objects in the middle of the table, he said, "Oh my goodness!" And then he tried to sort them, and he didn't even put the same number of objects in each pile, and couldn't do the task at all. Then when we reconstituted the task in his original way, he was perfect. And then, because one likes to had to have data hit over the head with data rather than be a protagonist for the data, we did the same thing 17 days later, and again he failed in the sorting task and performed perfectly when we reconstituted the task. There's an interesting anecdote about EP performance when he was performing well. I have to tell you a little more about how he did the task. The objects are placed in front of him, and all he's asked to do is to pick the correct object. And what he makes a selection by picking the object up and turning it over to see if the word correct is written on the bottom. So he's going along picking up objects, he says correct, and then the next one comes up and it's correct and it's correct. And EP says, how am I doing this? And Jennifer said to him, well, are you doing it because you remember from previous trials which object is correct and which object is incorrect? And EP said, no, it just goes from here, pointing to his head, to there, pointing to the table. So that seems to be the best we can do in talking about our habits. We also then tested GP, the second patient that I mentioned. GP also learned the task, in this case over a period of 14 weeks. We don't have an account of this early little splurge here, this little bump, but then he was very gradual. And when we gave GP the sorting task, he also was completely disabled by it, but performed well. When we reconstituted it in 17 days later again, we see poor performance and then a good performance. So these results tell us then that humans have a robust capacity for gradual trial and error learning that can operate outside awareness for what was learned and independently of the medial temporal lobe structures. So humans would learn this rapidly as declarative memory, but it can also be acquired more slowly. And in that case, it's rigidly organized, it's unaware learning, and it's quite different from declarative memory in its characteristics. So just briefly now, I'm going to turn to our final topic, which is the topic of remote memory, or we call it retrograde amnesia, which I'll explain in a second. So this is Theodore Ribot, the French philosopher and psychologist, who in 1881 in his book Les Maladies de la Mémoire, Diseases of Memory, he described the characteristics of memory impairment. And Ribot was fascinated by the phenomenon of retrograde amnesia, which refers to the fact that when patients develop amnesia, not only do they develop a failure of new learning capacity, which we call anterograde amnesia, but they also typically develop some retrograde amnesia. They lose some memories for the time before of events that occurred and things that were learned before they became amnesic. And what Ribot noticed was that when that happens, it's the new memories that are the more recent memories that are affected more than the more remote memories. That is, as Ribot put it, the new perishes before the old. And this, in fact, became known in the literature as Ribot's law. We've done a lot of studies of this phenomenon, and I'm just going to give you one tiny example based on EP's memory, because you saw his anterograde amnesia, you saw how impaired he was in acquiring new information. We query EP about his memories for his childhood environment. EP grew up in the Castro Valley, Hayward area of the East Bay across from San Francisco, but moved away as a young man and hasn't lived there since. And on the map here in this formal test that I'm going to give you just a little bit of data, a little bit of information about. On this map, we located a number of places that anybody who grew up there would know about. This is just a small part of the map. This, for example, is the Castro Valley Grammar School. This is the Bret Hart School. This is the Hayward Theater, and this is the Hayward High School. So we asked EP in a formal way how he would get from one place, from his home, to one of these places. We asked him how he would get from one place to another. We asked him how he would get from one place to another when the main street he just used is blocked. He had to find an alternate route. And we also asked him to stand in certain locations, imagine himself pointing in a certain direction and point to another location. For example, we would say, you're standing in front of a bank facing south, point to the Bay Bridge, and he would make a pointing movement. But I'm not going to show you all the data for that. Rather, I thought it might be even more interesting to hear him do this on film. So again, I'm going to play you a short excerpt from this same film that you saw before.
How about your house on Castro Valley Boulevard to the Hayward Theater? You remember where the Hayward Theater is?
Yes, I would leave the house and turn to the right to A Street, down A Street from Castro Boulevard, and turn to the left, and it's in the middle of the block.
Okay, and if you didn't go down to A Street, if you instead you could take another street, what would you do?
Center, Redwood Road. Redwood Road would run right into it.
How about the public library, Hayward Public Library, from your house?
Be the same thing going down A Street, and then you have to go to the left to P, and it's on the corner. I don't know.
The last thing I want to talk to you about is the neighborhood that we're in now.
Sure.
How about any of the streets around here? Can you tell me any of the street names in the neighborhood here?
No, I cannot.
That's a tough one.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, you don't need to apologize.
Well, I know where Castro Valley Boulevard, but that's where I was born and raised. But right here, I have to say no, I'm sorry. No, I just live right here.
Enjoy the world.
I enjoy our area right here.
So one doesn't have to claim that EP's remote memory is fully intact to appreciate the dramatic difference between his inability to learn new spatial locations and his dramatic ability to recall the details of his childhood environment. So this shows us then directly that the medial temporal lobe structures, including the hippocampus, that are important for new spatial learning are not similarly important for accessing the past. So the last slide I'll show you to summarize, again, back to neuroanatomy, which I like to say is the foundational discipline for cognitive neuroscience. Here you can see again these medial temporal lobe structures that we've been talking about, the hippocampus itself and the dentate gyrus and the subiculum, and the adjacent cortices, the entorhinal, perirhinal, and perihippocampal cortices. This is what we again call a simplified diagram of the cortical areas that project into the medial temporal lobe. The robustness of the projections corresponds to the thickness of the lines. So you can see that there's a number of cortical areas that have as their targets the medial temporal lobe memory system. And so what I've told you is that there are the multiple memory systems. This represents the operation of one memory system, the declarative memory, but these cortical structures interact with also with the amygdala and with the striatum in support of other kinds of memory like habit memory and fear memory, skillful memory, and so on. And secondly, I told you that the declarative memory is a conscious form of memory, and that some of the tasks that we can learn consciously and declaratively can also be learned unconsciously and non-declaratively, but through a different system and with a different result and a different cognitive product. And third, I told you that these medial temporal lobe structures don't appear to be the permanent repositories of memories because patients like EP have intact ability to access their remote past. And so it's this interaction between the medial temporal lobe and neocortex that makes that possible, and through a process that we don't understand very well, it's referred to as consolidation or reorganization, so that memories that are initially in the neocortex become permanently stored in the neocortex through the help of these medial temporal lobe structures. So I'll just say, if you're interested in following any of this up or looking into it further, I can point you to the book that I had the privilege of writing with Eric Kandel. And then I'll just say, too, that to remind us that work like that I've described to you is not done alone, but done with a team of people, undergraduate volunteers, graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and research assistants. And here we all are standing outside of our laboratory in Southern California in some unknown season. Yeah, thank you very much.
We won't take questions now unless there are specific questions or clarifications to this talk. We'll have a joint discussion after Simon's talk. And so if you have any questions for clarifications now, you can address them to Larry. But if not, we'll have the question and answer after we break the drinks. Thank you. So I'll just start introducing Simon straight away. I mean, to respond to a talk like this from a literary point of view, it must be a daunting task. But anybody who came to Simon's talk last time on Beckett's On Neighbour will know Simon is fearless. Simon is the tutorial fellow in French at Somerville College. He's interested in 20th and 21st century representations of mind in French fiction primarily. He's just completed a monograph called Writing the Mind, and he has a blog called Adventures on the Bookshelf that you may be interested in looking up. So Simon, thank you. Unconscious memory for cruise to the present.
Right, I shall just distract yourselves with the handouts while I finish setting up my IT. Oh, that was very easy. So this is a response to Larry, looking at unconscious memory from Proust to the present and searching for how the model that Larry has been laying out for us might be useful to people in the arts and humanities. If you ask what unconscious memory has generally meant to people in the arts, the term's been part of our critical discourse for the better part of a century, but in all of that time, it's largely been understood in psychoanalytic terms. When we've used the term memory, we've understood it as a capital with a capital U, as declarative memory, generally an event personally experienced, and the unconscious we've often understood with a capital U as the Freudian sealed chamber of the mind, into which is consigned everything the conscious mind finds too shameful or traumatic to contemplate, including memories of painful past experiences. They're isolated from the conscious mind. Unconscious material, Freud says, proliferates in the dark, as it were, and takes on extreme forms of expression, manifesting itself in coded dream images, slips, and neurotic feelings and behaviors, such as phobias or repetition compulsion. This is a model of unconscious memory that has served literary critics well, as we often follow in Freud's own footsteps where literature is concerned. For example, Freud's analysis of E.T.A. Hoffmann's Der Sandmann reads the story as an illustration of the return of the repressed, where the adult protagonist of the story is haunted by a demonic figure who resembles the man he blamed for his father's violent death many years before. And for Freud, the apparent supernatural elements of this tale can be rationalized as the unconscious memory of the protagonist's childhood trauma manifesting in his consciousness in the form of paranoid delusions. Now, Freud's division of the non-conscious mind into a pre-conscious storeroom into which we can delve at will, where you see dream states, recent experiences, and a sealed unconscious guarded by censoring gatekeepers, has become rather less plausible over the course of the century since it was proposed. There's widespread skepticism, too, about the process of repression by which memories are rendered unconscious and through which, according to Freud, the unconscious is brought into being in the first place. But if we choose not to abide by the psychoanalytic definition of unconscious memory, then the phrase is suddenly in danger of becoming tautological for our purposes. If you don't have Freud's distinction between preconscious and unconscious, then in one sense it's true that all your memories are unconscious, with the exception of the one that you're thinking about right now this minute. And as we've just seen, modern cognitive neuroscience proposes a new typology of memory, helpfully sent to me by Larry. This is Larry's own diagram. A new typology of memory which avoids this difficulty. So on the one hand, as we've heard, you have declarative memory of stored representations, the tune you heard, the fact you know, the experience you had, which can be recalled explicitly to consciousness. And on the other hand, you have this collection of systems which may not be related in the brain, which are given the umbrella label non-declarative memory, all of which involve a lasting imprint on mind and behavior from something experienced. But an imprint which doesn't take the form of words or images or other sense impressions that we can recall to mind and which we conventionally call memories. These non-declarative memories include, as we've heard, the skills and habits of procedural memory, priming and perceptual learning, conditioning, and the habituation and sensitization that make up non-associative learning. So, like psychoanalysis, the cognitive model divides memories up into those which are at least theoretically accessible to consciousness and those which are not. However, everything that psychoanalysis understands as memory is now all lumped together in the declarative category as memories that can be called to mind, whether or not you're presently able to do it. And in the other category, we have a new kind of unconscious memory, which is qualitatively incompatible with conscious representation. So what I'd like to do today, with the help of Larry's diagram, is take a look, without psychoanalytic spectacles, at how memory and the unconscious are associated in modern European literature. I want to see whether the model of unconscious memory as non-declarative memory offers a useful way to analyze the representation of memory in literature. And at the same time, I want to ask the question, if non-declarative memory, if these kinds of memory cannot be represented to consciousness, how can they be represented in literature? So I've basically been on a hunt through 20th and 21st century literature looking for representations which have something in common with the various kinds of non-declarative memory that Larry's been telling us about. So if we're going to study memory in modern European literature, we find a natural starting point in Proust, and that's where I'm going to begin. Proust, too, divides memory into two kinds, and a third different way of dividing memory up. He divides them into voluntary and involuntary memory, exemplified in the first section of À la recherche du temps perdu by his adult recollections of childhood. For much of his life, the narrator's life, all that he can recall is the anxious wait at bedtime to see if his mother will come and give him a goodnight kiss. This memory is highly vivid, with the rest of his childhood lost. And here's an extract from that famous opening to the novel. So it was that for a long time, when awakened at night, I remembered Cambrai again. I saw nothing of it but this sort of luminous panel cut out from among indistinct shadows, like those panels which the glow of a Bengal light, which in fact is a kind of firework, or some electric projection will cut out and illuminate in a building whose other parts remain plunged into darkness. As though Cambrai, his childhood holiday home, had consisted only of 2 floors connected by a slender staircase, and as though it had always been 7 o'clock in the evening there. The fact is, I could have answered anyone who asked me that Cambrai also included other things and existed at other hours, but since what I recalled would have been supplied to me only by my voluntary memory, the memory of the intelligence, and since the information it gives about the past preserves nothing of it, I would never have had any desire to think about the rest of Cambrai. It was all really quite dead for me. Then, famously, the taste of a madeleine dipped in lime blossom tea, a taste which he enjoyed regularly in his childhood, but crucially has never experienced in the intervening years, provides him with a direct link back to his past, and the memory resurfaces slowly and uncertainly, accompanied by a surge of happiness and amid marine imagery in the text, as if something dislodged from the seabed and ascending to the surface. So, both the bedtime anxiety and the flood of childhood experiences that make up the first part of Proust's novel fit into the category of declarative memories in our new typology. It's worth mentioning that Proust's voluntary and involuntary memory never were a good fit for the Freudian model of memory, despite the numerous psychoanalytic readings the novels received. Proust, who had no knowledge of Freud's theory, effectively flips it. The traumatic memory that psychoanalysis would have repressed into the unconscious is instead accessible at will, as if seared into the mind, while the anodyne memories of pleasant and neutral experiences are the ones that have faded. And incidentally, the existence of repression, I believe, remains a live question in neuroscience. V.S. Ramachandran is one voice from neuroscience who supports its existence, whereas a paper I came across by David S. Holmes marshals together the evidence against it, citing research findings that emotionally intense experiences were more likely to be recalled than less intense experiences, regardless of whether they were pleasant or unpleasant, which sounds very much like Proust's view. But what of non-declarative memories in Proust? Interestingly, the second time the narrator succumbs to Madeleine syndrome in the novel, no declarative memory is forthcoming. In a carriage ride with Madame de Villeparisis near the seaside town of Balbec, the narrator sees 3 trees in a line, and he's immediately struck with the same feeling of joy that accompanies the return of a memory. He says, "I gazed at the 3 trees, which I could see quite clearly, but my mind suspected they hid something on which it could have no purchase, as our fingertips at the full stretch of our arm may from time to time barely touch but not quite grasp objects which lie just out of reach. So one rests for a moment before trying harder with the arm outstretched in the hope of catching hold at last." So in this passage, the narrator's focusing on what's absent, the declarative memory that the sight of the trees fails to conjure up. But in doing that, he rather neglects what's present, a major disturbance in his state of mind caused by the effect of some past experience on his present, but which doesn't declare itself explicitly to his conscious mind. He says there's a feeling of profound bliss that opens the episode, which is followed by a disorienting confusion of inner and outer worlds. He says the countryside round Balbec shifted and faltered, and I had to ask myself whether this whole outing was not some figment, Balbec merely a place where I might once have been in my imagination. This sense of familiarity, of déjà vu perhaps, although the narrator denies that the connection is necessarily anything so straightforward as having seen a similar line of trees before, but this sense of familiarity very much fits the description of non-declarative memory. And furthermore, it serves to link together the 2 spheres of mental activity that Proust explores in great detail in his novel, but he doesn't himself unify. Involuntary memory triggered by trees or madeleines, and on the other hand, the process of habituation by which the unfamiliar gradually becomes familiar. The idea of non-associative learning, which we've heard mentioned earlier, of which habituation and sensitization form symmetrical parts, comes as much from the study of animals as of humans. If you place a stuffed owl in a cage full of songbirds, the birds will exhibit signs of distress. If you do so regularly over a period of time, the response of the songbirds will gradually diminish in intensity over time, as they become habituated to the stuffed owl's presence. Here is Proust telling us about his narrator's own stuffed owl experience. The narrator is spending a sleepless night in his first night in a hotel room at Baalbek. And what troubles him is the fact that the ceiling above his bed is higher than he's used to. He says, "It's those parts of us, even the most insubstantial and obscure of them, such as our attachment to the dimensions or the atmosphere of a particular room, which take fright, withhold consent, and engage in rebellions which must be seen as a covert and partial, yet tangible and true, mode of resistance to death. That lengthy, desperate, daily resistance to the sporadic but non-stop dying which attends us throughout our lives, stripping off bits of us at every moment, which have no sooner mortified than new cells begin to grow. For a nervous disposition such as mine, that is, one in which the functioning of the intermediaries, the nerves, is impaired, so that they fail to stifle the voice of the lowliest elements of self doomed to decease, and their harrowing, many-headed lament in all its sorrow rises unmuted to the wearied ears of consciousness. The anguish and alarm I felt when lying beneath a ceiling that was unknown and too high was nothing but the protest of my surviving attachment to a ceiling which was known and lower. No doubt that attachment would end and be replaced by another. First death, then a new life would have done their dual work at the behest of habit." So what's going on here with the talk of death? Here and as elsewhere, Proust is expounding his idea of serial selves. So when he says resistance to death, it's the resistance to death of one of his many selves which is dying as a new one comes to life. So old selves die and new selves are born as metaphors for our personality changing through the course of life. So for Proust, habituation consists of the death of the self for which the high ceiling is unfamiliar and anxiety-inducing, and its replacement by a new one born to whom the height of ceiling has come to seem normal. We can see the resolutely materialist Proust, who has no truck with souls, turning to biology to explicate this mind, in both a metaphorical sense, with the dying and regrowing cells of the self, but also in a literal sense, in his charming Edwardian neurology of his impaired nerves. The narrator's anxiety is caused not by a conscious comparison of the height of the hotel room ceiling with the height of the ceiling in his bedroom. This is his bedroom ceiling, not pictured. But still less by a memory image of lying in bed at home in his mind's eye. What first comes to consciousness is just a sense of unease, which he then has to analyse in order to find out its cause. Equally, the comforting sense of familiarity, once you've become habituated, occurs without conscious reference to the memory of the previous experience on which this familiarity is founded. In English modernism too, and I'm venturing a little out of my my comfort zone now as I move into English literature for the rest of the talk. English modernism, we find copious reference to the effects of non-declarative memory on the conscious mind. Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse proposes a detailed account of its protagonist's mental activity on the 2 days, a decade apart, in which its action unfolds. And the narrative is structured by memories, declarative and otherwise, which connect different points in time. Lily Briscoe is wordlessly moved as she stands before the scene she painted 10 years before, in which Mrs. Ramsay had been framed in the drawing room window. Mrs. Ramsay, who now, 10 years later, is dead. And this is what goes through Lily Briscoe's mind. For how could one express in words these emotions of the body? Express that emptiness there. She was looking at the drawing room steps. They looked extraordinarily empty. It was one's body feeling, not one's mind. The physical sensations that went with the bare look of the steps had become suddenly extremely unpleasant. To want and not to have sent all up her body a hardness, a hollowness, a strain. Like Proust and his ceilings, Woolf does have her character develop away from this inchoate emotion towards a conscious understanding of the comparison between the past and the present, which has given rise to it. In fact, the sequence ends a little bit later with Lily's exclamation, thought or spoken, "Oh, Mrs. Ramsay." So she realises that it's the absence of Mrs. Ramsay which is causing that feeling. But just as Proust's narrator's conscious thought, "this ceiling is too high," is the result of his anxiety and not the cause of it, so Lily's awareness that she's unhappy because of Mrs. Ramsay's absence comes after she's experienced this emotion. Non-declarative memory appears with shorter time spans in Woolf's novel too, and in phenomena we might be less inclined to label memory in the conventional sense. Priming, as we've heard, is defined as an implicit memory effect, whereby exposure to an earlier stimulus affects response to a later one. We see something at least similar, I would go as far as to say, to this effect on several occasions in To the Lighthouse, where characters appear to have been primed. A comment spoken appears to have been primed by something which happened earlier in the day. So, early in the novel, among Mrs. Ramsay's idle daytime thoughts is a fleeting indignation about milk. She's thinking of something else. She thinks to herself, milk delivered at your door in London, positively brown with dirt. It should be made illegal. And then she moves on to something else. That evening, at dinner, there crops up in conversation a complaint about the state of English coffee, upon which Mrs. Ramsay seizes control of the whole gathering to deliver a milk-based rant to general mocking hilarity. Then, said Mr. Banks, there is that liquid the English call coffee. Oh, coffee, said Mrs. Ramsay, but it was much rather a question, she was thoroughly roused, Libby could see, and talked very emphatically, of real butter and clean milk. Speaking with warmth and eloquence, she described the iniquity of the English dairy system and in what state milk was delivered to the door. Now, we're in Lily Briscoe's mind again, rather than Mrs. Ramsay's at this point. So we don't actually see in the novel the mental activity that's prompted Mrs. Ramsay to come out with these words. And it may be that a declarative memory comes to her mind. She remembers back to that moment early in the day when she was thinking about milk, and she then makes a conscious decision to replay her earlier thoughts out loud for the benefit of the assembled guests. But here and at other similar moments in the text, it's clear that we don't need to have any conscious memory of the earlier moment for this to work. It might simply be, Woolf is implying, that her previous indignation has left the topic of substandard English milk delivery at the forefront of her mind, with the result that there's a ready association waiting to be made, and when prompted by a similar subject, such as the inadequacy of English coffee. And as she sits down to dinner, Mrs. Ramsay is primed for a tirade, and she receives the requisite stimulus to supply one. Modern literature thus happily tackles mental phenomena, at least related to habituation and priming, as cognitive science describes them. What about other forms of non-declarative memory? Procedural memory, perhaps, the proverbial memory of how to ride a bike, or the automatism that drives us our usual route home without any conscious effort on our part. And there must be interesting representations of procedural memory to be found in earlier literature too, if we care to look, perhaps in the well-grooved daily routine of Joyce's Leopold Bloom, with his absent-minded perambulations around Dublin, allowing his feet to take him past Windmill Lane, down Lime Street and across Townsend Street, while his mind remains otherwise occupied with the Hebrew alphabet and an old love affair. Or perhaps in the ritual, futile repetitions of Samuel Beckett's bike-riding, stone-sucking, step-ladder climbing, toothbrushing, mud-crawling protagonists, for whom habit is the great deadener. We can certainly see procedural memory in a more recent text, in Ian McEwan's 21st century neuro-novel, Saturday, which takes us moment by moment through a neurosurgeon's weekend, with particular focus on the subjective experience and the neural activity that may underlie it. Here, for instance, is the muscle memory of movement and gesture in sport taking over from conscious decision-making during a game of squash. It's possible, in a long rally, to become a virtually unconscious being, inhabiting the narrowest slice of the present, merely reacting, taking one shot at a time, existing only to keep going. Perowne is already at that state, digging in deep when he remembers he's supposed to have a game plan. And that's a short extract from, in fact, a very long account of game of squash, which has all kinds of references to unconscious behaviour. I want to move on briskly from procedural memory, though, because there is one final facet of non-declarative memory that made such a mark on 20th century literature that it demands the remaining time I have to examine it. And I'm talking about psychological conditioning. And the three great 20th century novels of conditioning, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, George Orwell's 1984, and Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange. So, conditioning in psychology is divided into classical conditioning, exemplified by Pavlov. There we have a nice example of Pavlov's dogs, in which association is created between two stimuli, such as a bell and dinner in Pavlov's experiments, with the result that the conditioned organism, the conditioned dog's usual response to dinner, drooling, will over time become a response to the bell alone. Classical conditioning generally works with reflex responses. It attaches an existing response to a new stimulus. Operant conditioning, the central idea of the behaviorism movement within 20th century psychology, involves the modification of behavior through a system of repeated rewards and punishments consequent to actions to reinforce desired behavior and diminish the undesired. And it has a slightly more, I think, difficult relationship to the idea of unconscious memory, since it obviously involves quite a lot of conscious activity and conscious thought as well. So I've given you some extracts from these three novels. I've given you quite extensive extracts, in fact, in case you're interested in looking at the context of them after, but I'm going to just pick out the sections in bold. Here's Brave New World. In this novel, conditioning begins before consciousness has even fully developed. Lab-grown embryos are conditioned to adapt to the working environments they're destined for. So embryonic workers who are heading for the tropics alternate periods of high temperature with a combined dose of coolness and X-rays. Future zero-gravity workers are rotated in their flasks as they're developing and starved of nutrients whenever the flask is the right way up. And the result is you get tropical workers who shun cooler climes, and you get rocket repair teams who are, I quote, only truly happy when they're standing on their heads. This scene I've given you here, though, is about young children where a bunch of infants are brought into a room which has flowers and books. They crawl towards the books, and then loud noises and electric shocks are used to inculcate them with an enduring aversion to books and flowers. So here's an extract from that piece. Offer them the flowers and books again. The nurses obeyed, but at the approach of the roses, at the mere sight of those gaily coloured images of Pussy and Cock-a-doodle-doo and Baa Baa Black Sheep, the infants shrank away in horror. The volume of their howling suddenly increased. Observe, said the director triumphantly, observe. Books and loud noises, flowers and electric shocks. Already in the infant mind, these couples were compromisingly linked, and after 200 repetitions of the same, or a similar lesson, would be wedded indissolubly. What man has joined, nature is powerless to put asunder. This scene is very closely modelled on the notorious Little Albert experiments carried out by John B. Watson, sometimes known as the father of behaviorism, in which a child who had demonstrated no previous fear of a white rat, I think that's him demonstrating no previous fear, was conditioned into an aversion by the repeated use of a loud noise when the animal was in his presence. I think Watson stood behind him and clanged two bits of metal together whenever the rat was there. An aversion that the child subsequently generalised to other furry animals and even a fur coat, according to the experimenter's claims. Second piece of conditioning. Here's O'Brien in 1984 discussing the rationale behind the conditioning process Winston Smith's undergoing in the Ministry of Love to convert him from thought criminal to party faithful. We're not content with negative obedience, nor even with most abject submission. When finally you surrender to us, it must be of your own free will. We do not destroy a heretic because he resists us. So long as he resists us, we never destroy him. We convert him. We capture his inner mind. We reshape him. We burn all evil and all illusion out of him. We bring him over to our side, not in appearance, but genuinely, heart and soul. We make him one of ourselves before we kill him. Orwell's less explicit than the other two about the details of the process his protagonist undergoes to reverse his attitude towards the regime, but certainly not all of it's unconscious. Room 101 in particular involves the conscious decision to betray Julia, and its effectiveness in destroying the bond between them relies on the declarative memory of this betrayal remaining forever in reach of consciousness. But the program Winston undergoes before he reaches that point is based on the association of torture with heretical thought, torture that very often bypasses consciousness in continuing after its victim has been pushed into delirium. And lastly, here's Alex in A Clockwork Orange discussing with his captors the treatment which involves injecting him with drugs that make him feel extremely ill while simultaneously showing him images of violence. You're making me feel ill. I'm ill when I look at those filthy pervert films of yours. But it's not really the films that's doing it. But I feel that if you'll stop these films, I'll stop feeling ill. Right, said Dr. Brodsky. It's association, the oldest educational method in the world. We can get this stuff of Ludovicos, the drugs, which are making him feel sick, into your system in many different ways, orally, for instance, but the subcutaneous method is the best. Don't fight against it, please. There's no point in your fighting. You can't get the better of us. You're not cured yet. There's still a lot to be done. only when your body reacts promptly and violently to violence, as to a snake, without further help from us, without medication, only then. Burgess explicitly calls A Clockwork Orange a novel about brainwashing. And he adds the interesting corollary that it's not only through the conditioning of Alex that the reader is to experience this. Nadsat, Burgess's invented teen slang based on Russian, is intended to give the readers a little taste of brainwashing for themselves. He says, Nadsat was meant to turn Clockwork Orange into, among other things, a brainwashing primer. You read the book or see the film, and at the end, you should find yourself in possession of a minimal Russian vocabulary, without effort, with surprise. This is the way brainwashing works. There's something else, though, that sets Burgess's conditioning apart from the other two examples. It doesn't work. When Alex, he's goaded to suicide by one of his former victims, and when he wakes in hospital after this failed suicide attempt, he finds himself to have been, in his words, cured of the conditioning, with his inhibitions towards Beethoven and ultraviolence now removed. Burgess's commentary on this ending counters behaviourist doctrine from the perspective of his own Christian belief. He says, what my and Kubrick's parable tries to state is that it's preferable to have a world of violence undertaken in full awareness, violence chosen as an act of will, than a world conditioned to be good or harmless. B.F. Skinner, who is a pupil of Watson, in fact, and came to be the most prominent advocate of behaviourism in the mid-20th century. Skinner, with his ability to believe that there's something beyond freedom and dignity, wants to see the death of autonomous man. He may or may not be right, but in terms of the Judeo-Christian ethic that A Clockwork Orange tries to express, he's perpetrating a gross heresy. The wish to diminish free will is, I should think, the sin against the Holy Ghost. So, in Orwell's and Huxley's material worlds in their novels, the mind is as malleable as the brain on which it supervenes. For the Catholic Burgess, though, the essence of the self lies beyond the reach of any conditioning imprint because it's in an immaterial soul. The term behaviourist novel has got some currency in literary criticism. In French studies, it's particularly connected to the critic Claude Edmond Magny. But when we use it, it tends to get applied to novelists like Ernest Hemingway or John Dos Passos, who offer an exclusively external perspective on their characters without affording the reader any access to their subjectivity. The suggestion is that external narrative perspectives recall the behaviourists' outlawing of consciousness as a fit subject for scientific study, insisting, as they did, that only observable behaviour was proper evidence for psychology. Evidence for a link between behaviourist thought and writing like Hemingway's is actually rather dubious. Visual storytelling in the cinema seems a much more likely contender to be the important influence there. The real behaviourist novelists of the 20th century are surely Burgess, Orwell, and Huxley, with their explorations of free will overridden by an acquired response to stimulus. While it's classical Pavlovian conditioning that falls most clearly within non-declarative memory, as the conditioned reflex is contained, created, and maintained without any recourse to conscious thought, all of these novels present their conditioning, classic or operant, in similar terms. Once the lesson's learned, there's no conscious recall of the teaching required to produce the effect. Rather, it manifests in all three of these as an instinctive, visceral reaction, seeming in some cases to the character concerned to be more of a physical than a mental phenomenon. So, to conclude, once we start looking for unconscious memory, redefined from the psychoanalytic understanding to refer to the various forms of non-declarative memory, we find representations of it, or something very like it, widely in modern Western literature. The concept might be a relatively recent one in psychology, but it's been a major theme in European literature throughout the last century. Habituation, priming, procedural memory, and conditioning all play a role in the 20th century novel. Sometimes there's intentional engagement on the writer's part with contemporary scientific research, as we saw in today's neuronovelists like McEwan, or in the novels of conditioning in the mid-century heyday of behaviourist psychology. Often, though, these writers are describing subjective phenomena, the anxiety of unfamiliar surroundings, the lingering thought triggered back to life in conversation, coming from their own or others' experience without any reference to formal psychology. None of the writers before the 21st century refers to any of these phenomena as memory. That term is used exclusively for declarative memory, as throughout the 20th century it was, and as largely it still is. But while they might not have labelled these various forms of mental activity as memory, they examined their functioning closely, and they depicted in lucid detail the subjective experience of habituation, priming, conditioning, and related processes. These representations not only offer us a record of qualia, as David Lodge put it, expressing how it feels for your past experience to modify your present sense without conscious awareness of what's being remembered. For us as readers and critics, this new definition of unconscious memory allows us to draw new connections between psychological phenomena represented in literature, ceiling height anxiety, milkman irritation, squash games, and totalitarian torture, all brought together for the first time as the subjective manifestations of related kinds of mental activity. And once we connect these phenomena through contemporary neuroscience, we can see that in fact they're already connected thematically in the texts themselves. Collectively, these episodes I've been discussing form the subject matter for a debate held by these 20th century writers inside their story worlds among their characters and outside them with their readers. A debate as to how far the conscious mind is in control. In each of these examples, in a variety of different ways, we've seen the past act upon the present self without the subject's awareness. Often the action's undesired, sometimes it affects a permanent change. As readers, our attention is drawn to mental activity occurring outside consciousness, involuntarily, yet having sometimes profound effects on mood or personality. All these texts point us towards the mind that exists beyond the sphere of conscious awareness, and throw into doubt any suggestion that the conscious mind might be the unchallenged master of the self. Thank you.